Lastly, the hydroxyl radical, which we represent like this. It's basically a hydroxyl group or an OH group that has gotten loose and is wandering around causing mayhem. And it's the most reactive of the oxygen byproducts of redox reactions. And it's caused by ionizing radiation. Think gamma rays, X-rays, that kind of thing. That's why ionizing radiation is so dangerous to living organisms, is because it produces these hydroxyl radicals. It is also caused by the incomplete reduction of hydrogen peroxide. Now, hydrogen peroxide does not build up in aerobic cells, so we generally don't have to worry about this unless you're exposed to large amounts of ionizing radiation. You've heard about antioxidants. And vitamins C and E are antioxidants. They provide electrons to reduce the toxic forms of oxygen. So they take part in making sure that these hydroxide radicals don't go around causing death to the cell. So, having learned about the 4 different types of oxygen byproducts, we're going to learn some terms that describe how organisms need oxygen or need to be protected from oxygen. So the first one is obligate aerobe. So they must have oxygen to live. Basically, you are an obligate aerobe because if you don't breathe oxygen, you die. And obligate aerobes are unable to ferment. Now you've just thought, now wait a minute, back in chapter 5, Teresa talked about how our muscle cells can ferment until the respiratory system gets caught up. Well, that's true. I lied. Not all of you is an obligate aerobe, but your brain is. Your brain is unable to ferment. Now we gotta have a microbial example of an obligate aerobe because, we can't stick with your brain cells because they're eukaryotic. An example would be the genus Pseudomonas. They are unable to ferment and they have to have oxygen. They're very unhappy without it. So then we get to facultative anaerobes. Facultative anaerobes are those organisms that are okay with or without oxygen. They grow faster in the presence of oxygen. And why is that? Think back to chapter 5 and think about how many ATPs are produced by aerobic respiration versus how many ATPs are produced through fermentation. So your muscle cells would fall under the category of facultative anaerobes. Another example of a facultative anaerobe would be E. coli in your gut. They're okay with or without. So they have the enzymes for both aerobic respiration or fermentation. They can go either way. Microaerophiles are those organisms that need a little bit of oxygen, but it's got to be less than the amount of oxygen that you find in regular atmospheric conditions. So they need approximately 2 to 10% oxygen, and this is because they have a limited ability to detoxify hydrogen peroxide and superoxide radicals, but they still want the oxygen so that they can undergo aerobic respiration. So one of the organisms that would fit in this category would be Helicobacter pylori, or the organism that is found to be the causative agent of quite a few ulcers. Makes sense, you have oxygen in your stomach, but you don't have as much oxygen as, say, in your lungs. The next category are aerotolerant anaerobes. These are organisms that don't use oxygen. They do not have an electron transport chain, but they are not killed by it. Well, how do they manage that? Well, they have enzymes that deal with the toxic forms of oxygen even though they don't have an electron transport chain. So if you're going to be an aerobe, being an aerotolerant aerobe is the best of both worlds. So an example of an aerotolerant anaerobe would be lactobacilli. Those lovely lactobacilli that are making your yogurt and cheese, they don't use oxygen. And so, but they're not killed by it. So you can mix up the milk and you can do all sorts of fun things to it and not bother the lactobacilli any. Now, on the other hand, we do have obligate anaerobes. These are organisms that are killed by oxygen because they lack superoxide dimutase. And they lack or have small amounts of catalase and peroxidase. So with these guys, we have to grow them in oxygen-free environments. Now, some obligate anaerobes undergo anaerobic respiration. So they do have an electron transport chain. They're just using sulfur as the terminal electron acceptor. Most of the anaerobes that you're going to deal with in lab are not nearly so exciting. They are organisms that undergo fermentation, but you can't expose them to oxygen. And one of these is the genus Clostridium. Some of these species in Clostridium are Clostridium tetani, okay, Clostridium botulinum, and you get to guess on your own what diseases those cause. And you're going, but wait a minute. Okay, how do you get tetanus from stepping on a rusting nail if Clostridium tetani is an obligate anaerobe? Well, they produce endospores. That's how they survive oxygen environments. They don't metabolize, or they metabolize very little. They go into the endospore state. It's a resting stage. When they're in an oxygen-free environment where there's lots of lovely food, say deep in the tissues of your foot after you've stepped on a nail, then the endospores sprout and become vegetative cells that produce toxins that cause you great problems. So before we leave oxygen requirements, let's talk about how we can tell what kind of organism it is by growing it in the lab. Here we have figures that represent some media that we call reducing media. It's got molecules in there that bind up oxygen so that the microbe can't get to it. So we have a loose fitting cap so that oxygen can sneak in through the top, but generally there's a color indicator that indicates where the oxygen is. So if you have all of your growth in a reducing media that's all at the top, then we know it is a obligate anaerobe. If you find them huddling down at the bottom as far away from where the oxygen is, then that is an obligate anaerobe. Now, if we find them growing more up here where there's oxygen, but we still find them growing clear throughout, this would be a facultative anaerobe. It's growing faster where it has access to oxygen for aerobic respiration, less fast where it has to rely on fermentation. If it has uniform growth throughout the media, you know it's an aerotolerant anaerobe. Now, the one that they don't show you is if it's growing right about here. It's still in the oxygen area, but it's not at the highest concentration. It's not down where there's no oxygen. That's where we would find a microaerophile. Okay, on to nitrogen requirements. You're going, oh, thank goodness, enough with the oxygen. Let's talk about nitrogen. You gotta have nitrogen if you're gonna make amino acids and nucleotides. And what do you make from amino acids? Proteins. What's the biggest percentage of the 4 macromolecules in the cell? It's proteins. You gotta have nitrogen for your amino acids. Also, what do you make from nucleotides? DNA and RNA. So it's kind of hard to make proteins without nucleic acids and without amino acids. So all organisms require usable nitrogen. Often it's the growth limiting nutrient, and we'll get to that in a minute as to why. So there are organic and inorganic nutrients that provide nitrogen. One of these is nitrate. So it can be reduced to ammonium, and ammonium is readily usable by most organisms. So also organisms recycle their own amino acids because nitrogen is so hard to come by, and nucleotides, they recycle their nucleotides. Same reason. You're probably thinking, now wait a minute, didn't I read somewhere that most of our atmosphere is nitrogen? You are correct, but it's hard to get at. Only organisms that can undergo nitrogen fixation are able to make use of atmospheric nitrogen. Here's why. This is what atmospheric nitrogen looks like. It wants to share 3 pairs of electrons, and this makes for a very stable molecule. It is really, really hard to break that triple bond. The single bond between the nitrogen and this hydrogen, piece of cake. The single bond between the oxygen and the nitrogen here, piece of cake. Even double bonds are not as hard to break as this triple bond. And so there are very few organisms that are able to undergo nitrogen fixation, and so far as we know, they're all bacteria. And they have to perform nitrogen fixation in the absence of oxygen, because oxygen goes in, kills the enzyme that is prying these two atoms of nitrogen apart. So, the organisms that undergo nitrogen fixation oftentimes will put themselves in an oxygen-free environment, or they will protect cells that are undergoing nitrogen fixation. Let's talk about cyanobacteria. Probably the first organisms to ever undergo nitrogen fixation. What they do is they have colonial forms. Most of the organisms are undergoing oxygenic photosynthesis. Okay, they're undergoing photosynthesis that produces oxygen, which would inhibit their ability to fix nitrogen. Well, in the string, you will often have what is called a heterocyst. It's a bigger cell, has a thick wall, and it's shutting itself off from oxygen. So they undergo nitrogen fixation, and they export usable nitrogen to the cells that are photosynthesizing. The cells that are photosynthesizing import sugar to the cells that are fixing nitrogen. Kind of cool, huh? You've probably heard of the organisms, bacteria, that live in the roots of legumes, peas, lentils, that sort of thing. Well, the plant protects them from oxygen. The bacteria live in nodules in the roots of the plant. The plant roots are not undergoing photosynthesis, but they bring sugar down from the leaves, feed it to the bacteria. The bacteria says, oh, thank you very much. Here's some usable nitrogen in the form of ammonium. So it all works out very nicely. Okay, last thing, trace elements and growth factors. So far, we've been talking about macronutrients. Carbon, high energy electron sources, oxygen, nitrogen. There are some elements that cells only need in a little bit. And so here are your macronutrients. That takes up about 90% of the cell. So we have these other things. We have phosphate, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, magnesium, copper, iron. That takes up about 5% if we round it off. Then we get to the trace elements. Selenium is a good one. It's now, not all requirements for growth are elements. Sometimes they are organic molecules, and we call these growth factors. So there are some organisms that if you give them CO2, water, light, and minerals, they are just happy, they grow, and they don't need anything else. Others require organic molecules that they can't synthesize in addition to their carbon and their energy needs. So what are some examples of these organic molecules? Some of these are called vitamins. Humans need vitamins. They are growth factors. They are oftentimes cofactors that we can't make ourselves. So we have to get them in our diet. Coenzymes. There are some coenzymes that we as humans don't need, so we don't call them vitamins. We call them coenzymes. Well, there's a few, like cofactor Q10. We didn't call that one a vitamin. Cholesterol. You're going, good heavens, we need less cholesterol. Well, so some organisms, some bacteria, cannot form their own steroids, so we have to supply them. Now, they can take cholesterol, and they can form their own steroids, and they're happy, but they won't grow. In fact, they die if you don't provide that to them. Some organisms need extra amino acids. We humans, we have essential amino acids that we can't make ourselves, so we have to get them in our diet. And there are some bacteria that are in the same category. They have to be provided these amino acids. Nucleotides, there are some microbes that can't make their own nucleotides, so you have to put them into the media to grow them. And some organisms can't make their own NADH or NAD+. Oftentimes, these are obligate parasites because they have to live in close association with another cell, oftentimes inside. So you can kind of see how the more growth factors you need, the more requirements you need from your environment, the more likely you are to be a pathogen.